I handed police the evidence that sent my own mother to prison for 8 years. The detective set the flash drive on the table between us and said, "Before I take this, I need you to understand that once you give it to me, there's no taking it back." He said it the way people say things when they think the person across from them might not have fully grasped the gravity of the moment. Detective Kwame Asare, 20 years in financial crimes, a man with reading glasses he never seemed to use for reading, just pushed up on his forehead like a second set of eyes. I looked at the flash drive. It was a plain black SanDisk, 32 gigabytes, the kind you can buy in a 3-pack at any pharmacy. On it was 4 years of documentation that I had been quietly, methodically building since I was 22 years old. Bank records, emails, forged signatures, a spreadsheet I had maintained in a folder on a cloud account my mother did not know about, tracking transactions that did not add up in ways I had spent years trying to make add up before I accepted that they couldn't. I picked up the drive and placed it in Detective Asare's hand. I said, "I understand." He closed his fingers around it. That was the moment. Everything after that was consequence. I need to tell you about my grandmother first, because my grandmother is why any of this happened. Miriam Oluwole was 81 years old and had been born in Lagos and had come to the United States at 26 with my grandfather and $40 and the specific ferocious practicality of a person who understood that survival was a full-time occupation. She raised 3 children, buried a husband at 60, kept working until she was 72, and retired with enough savings, carefully accumulated over 5 decades of deliberate, unglamorous financial discipline to live comfortably and to leave something for her grandchildren. She was specific about the grandchildren. She had told me, at her kitchen table when I was 17, that she wanted her grandchildren to have the kind of beginning she had not had, the kind that absorbed some of the initial friction of a life. She had a figure in mind. She had said it plainly, $250,000, split between her 3 grandchildren when she died, administered by her estate. She had shown me the will. She had her lawyer's name on a card on the refrigerator. She had been, in all things, the kind of person who said what she meant and meant what she said. She died when I was 22, in the October of my last year of university, peacefully, in the house she had lived in for 31 years. And that is when my mother became someone I did not recognize. My mother's name is Adaeze Oluwole Briggs. She is 61 years old. She was, for most of my childhood, a competent and professionally successful woman, a hospital administrator who ran a mid-size regional facility with the organized efficiency of someone who took institutional order seriously. She was not warm in the way that some mothers are warm, the kind that pull you into kitchens and let you lick the spoon. She was warm in a different register, consistent, present, reliable. When she said she would come to something, she came. When she said she would handle something, it was handled. I trusted her the way you trust load-bearing walls, without thinking about it, because they have always been there and you have no reason to imagine they might not be. That trust was the most expensive thing I have ever possessed. The estate should have been straightforward. My grandmother's lawyer was a man named Eugene Thorpe, a sole practitioner who had handled her affairs for 15 years and who filed the probate documents within weeks of her death. My mother was named executor, the oldest child, the most organized, the one with the financial background. My uncle Tobias, my grandmother's second child, was in Abuja managing a construction business and had made clear that he trusted my mother to handle things. My aunt Celestine, the youngest, lived 40 minutes away and had a complicated relationship with money that she managed by largely deferring to whoever seemed most competent to make decisions about it. My mother was the executor, and she was trusted by everyone, and the estate was valued at just over $900,000, of which $250,000 was earmarked for the grandchildren in equal thirds. I was 22. My cousin Taiwo, Tobias's son, was 20. My cousin Ife, Celestine's daughter, was 18. We were told the process would take approximately 12 to 18 months. It took 4 years and produced nothing. The first thing I noticed was timing. 12 months after my grandmother's death, I emailed my mother asking about the estate timeline. She wrote back promptly, she was always prompt, and said there were complications with probate, that some assets were proving difficult to value, that Eugene Thorpe was working through it, and she would update me when there was news. I accepted this. Probate was known to be slow. I was 23 and working my first real job at an accounting firm, and I was busy, and I trusted her. 18 months out, I asked again. Complications continued, she said. Some of the investment accounts required additional documentation. She was on top of it. 24 months out, I mentioned it to my cousin Taiwo over the phone, and he said he had not heard anything either, that his father had asked and been told the same thing. I told myself estates took time. I told myself my mother was a competent woman managing a complex situation. I told myself the story I needed to tell myself to keep trusting the load-bearing wall. The thing that cracked it was an accident, the way many things that crack are accidents. I was visiting my Aunt Celestine at her house on a Saturday in March, 26 months after my grandmother died, and Celestine was looking for something in a file drawer in her home office, and she pulled out a folder and said, "Not particularly to me. This is from Eugene, back when your mother removed him. I said, Removed who? Celestine looked up. She had the expression of a person who has said something they assumed was known and has just discovered it was not. She said, Eugene Thorpe. Your mother replaced him about 8 months ago. Didn't you know? I said I did not know. Celestine said, She said he wasn't moving fast enough. She hired someone else. She handed me the folder without appearing to think much of it. Inside was a letter from Eugene Thorpe to my grandmother's estate, dated 8 months earlier, confirming his withdrawal from the matter and referencing concerns about the direction of estate administration that he said he had communicated directly to the executor. He had communicated concerns, and then he had been replaced. I drove home with that folder in my passenger seat, and I sat in my apartment for a very long time before I called Eugene Thorpe's office on the following Monday morning. Eugene Thorpe was 64 years old and had 28 years of estate law practice. He agreed to meet with me, and he was careful in the meeting, the careful of a professional who had ethical obligations he was navigating, but he confirmed enough. He had raised concerns about certain account transfers during the early phase of estate administration, transactions that moved estate funds into an account he had not been provided full documentation for. He had asked my mother for explanation and received responses that he described as inconsistent with standard fiduciary practice. He had notified her formally of his concerns. She had notified him formally that his services were no longer required. He had consulted with a colleague about his obligations and had determined that without a formal complaint from a beneficiary, his ability to take action was limited. He told me that if I believed there were irregularities, I had standing as a beneficiary to request a full accounting of estate transactions. He told me the name of the new estate attorney my mother had hired. He told me I should document everything. He said, I hope I'm wrong about what I think happened. He said it in the tone of a man who did not think he was wrong. I went home and I built a spreadsheet. I am an accountant. Numbers are my language. I pulled together every piece of documentation I had access to. My grandmother's original will, the probate filing records which were public, correspondence from my mother about the estate, bank statements from a joint account my grandmother and my mother had maintained that I had access to through my grandmother's online banking, which my grandmother had set up years earlier and added me to as a backup contact. I should have been removed from that account when my grandmother died. I had not been. Whether that was an oversight or a piece of luck, I cannot tell you, but it was what it was, and what it showed me, over 3 months of careful examination, was a pattern. Transfers out of estate-adjacent accounts in amounts and at frequencies that did not correspond to probate costs or legal fees or any legitimate estate expense I could identify. The amounts were not always large. That was the craft of it, the consistency of small movements that aggregated into something very large. I ran the numbers 4 times because I did not trust myself to be seeing what I was seeing. The 4th time produced the same result as the first 3. I sat at my desk at 11 at night looking at my own spreadsheet and felt something in my chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but was the specific sensation of a structure you have stood on your entire life giving way beneath you. I spent 1 month trying to find an explanation that was not the obvious one. That is important to me to say clearly. I did not go immediately to the police. I went first to every alternative. I called my mother and asked, carefully, about the estate status, fishing for anything that might explain what I had seen without confronting it directly. She gave me the same answer she had given me for 2 years. Complications, documentation, working through it. Her voice was exactly what it had always been. Controlled, organized, reliable. I called Tobias in Abuja and told him obliquely that I had some questions about the estate and asked if he had received any updates. He said no, that he had assumed his sister was handling it. I called Celestine and asked whether she had ever seen a full accounting of the estate. She said she had not thought to ask for one. I contacted the new estate attorney my mother had hired, a man named Frederick Bokey, who had 12 years of practice and who was, to his credit, clearly uncomfortable in our phone call, clearly aware that something was wrong and equally clearly constrained by his obligations to his client. He would not tell me anything useful. What he told me by not telling me was useful enough. I went to a financial crimes attorney named Petra Lindqvist, 21 years in practice, referral from a colleague at my firm who knew I was looking for someone specific. I told her everything in a 2-hour meeting. I brought the spreadsheet, printed, and the account records, and the letter from Eugene Thorpe, and a timeline I had constructed. She read everything slowly. She asked clarifying questions. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "What you're describing is elder financial abuse and estate fraud. The total appears to be in the range of $300,000 or more based on what you've documented here." I said I thought so too. She said, "I want to be clear with you about what this process looks like. Reporting this means a criminal investigation. It means your mother will be investigated. It may mean charges. You need to understand what you are initiating." I said I understood. She said, "Are there other people who have been harmed by this?" I said yes. My cousins Taiwo and Ife, my uncle Tobias, possibly others I didn't know about. She said, "Then it's not only your decision in moral terms, even if it's yours in practical terms." I drove home and I sat with that sentence for 3 days before I called my cousins. Telling Taiwo was the harder of the two calls. He had worshipped my mother his entire life in the way that children of absent or difficult parents sometimes worship the alternative adult who is present and competent. His father had been in Nigeria for most of his childhood. My mother had been the one who showed up to his school events, who sent the birthday cards, who he had called when he needed adult advice. I told him what I had found. There was a silence on the phone so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then he said, "Show me the numbers." I sent him the spreadsheet. He called me back 4 hours later and his voice had changed into something flattened and careful. He said, "What are we going to do?" I told him what Petra Lindqvist had told me. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "My dad trusted her with everything. He didn't even read the documents she sent him. He just signed them because she asked him to." I said I knew. He said, "Okay." The same word again. The weight of it. Ife was 25 by then, quiet and precise in the way of a person who has developed precision as a response to chaos, and she listened to everything I told her without interrupting and then said, "I always felt like something was off, but I didn't know what to do with that feeling." She said she was in. She said she had emails from my mother about the estate that she could forward to me, correspondence in which my mother had described in writing certain transactions that I could now match to the irregular transfers in my spreadsheet. Those emails became Exhibit C in the eventual prosecution. Ife had kept them, filed in a folder labeled with my grandmother's name, not because she suspected anything, but because she had loved my grandmother and could not bring herself to delete anything that mentioned her. Sometimes the things that save you are not plans. Sometimes they are grief. Detective Kwame Asare of the Financial Crimes Unit was assigned after I made the initial report with the county police. He had 20 years in the division and an office that was aggressively undecorated except for a single framed photograph of a woman I assumed was his mother. He reviewed my documentation over 2 meetings and told me at the end of the second one that I had done the most complete pre-report documentation he had seen from a civilian complainant in his career. I did not know how to take that as a compliment, but he meant it as one. He told me the investigation would take time. Financial crimes investigations always took time because the documentation was voluminous and the forensic accounting had to be thorough enough to withstand a defense challenge. He told me not to discuss the investigation with anyone in my family except Taiwo and Ife, who were co-complainants. He told me, carefully, that my mother would eventually be informed of the investigation and that I should be prepared for the contact that would likely follow. He said it in the voice of a man who had seen many of these situations and knew what happened when the subject of a financial crimes investigation discovered who had reported them. My mother called me on a Thursday evening 7 weeks after I handed Asare the flash drive. I had not told her about the investigation, had maintained our ordinary twice-monthly phone calls with a steadiness that cost me more than I knew how to account for. She said she needed to speak to me, and the voice was not the organized administrator's voice. It was something stripped down, something underneath the usual surface. I said I was listening. She said, "Detectives came to my office today." I said I was listening. She said, "Kwame, I know it was you." I said yes. She made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she said, "Why didn't you come to me first?" I had prepared for this question. I had thought about it for months, from the beginning of the documentation forward. I said, "I did come to you. For 2 years. Every time I asked about the estate, I was coming to you. I was giving you every opportunity to tell me something true." Silence. I said, "You chose not to." More silence. Then she said, "I needed the money." I sat with that sentence for a moment. My grandmother had worked 5 decades to leave her grandchildren something, had shown me the will at her kitchen table, and said she wanted us to have a beginning. I thought about Miriam Olawole and $40 and 40 years of discipline. I said, "I know you did. That's not a reason." My mother did not say anything else. She hung up. That was the last real conversation we had before her arraignment. The investigation took 14 months. Forensic accountant Renata Osei, contracted by the county prosecutor's office and with 18 years of financial forensics experience, produced a 212-page report that documented $387,000 in unauthorized estate transfers across a period of 31 months. The money had gone into 3 accounts, one in my mother's name, one in the name of a limited liability company she had formed 6 months after my grandmother's death, one in an account belonging to a man named Douglas Akiampong, with whom, the investigation determined, my mother had been in a relationship for 4 years and to whom she had transferred a significant portion of the funds. Douglas Akiampong cooperated with investigators and provided testimony in exchange for reduced charges. My mother's attorney, a criminal defense lawyer named Bernard Nwachukwu, with 17 years of practice in white-collar crime, entered a not guilty plea at arraignment. The case went to trial. The trial lasted 9 days. I testified. I had known I would be asked to testify, and I had prepared for it with Petra Lindqvist across several sessions, going through my documentation line by line until I could speak to each piece of evidence without referencing my notes. I sat in the witness box and I answered the prosecutor's questions, and I answered Bernard Nwachukwu's questions, and I did not look at my mother during my testimony because I had decided in advance that I would not, and I kept that decision. I looked at the jury, at the prosecutor, at the documents being shown on the screen. I was precise, and I was accurate, and I did not dramatize anything because the facts did not require dramatization. At one point, Nwachukwu asked me whether it was possible that I had misinterpreted the financial records, whether I had considered that the transactions might have legitimate explanations I was not aware of. I said that I had spent a year looking for legitimate explanations before reporting and had not found them, and that the subsequent forensic investigation had confirmed my analysis independently. He did not ask me that question again. The verdict was guilty on all counts: elder financial abuse, estate fraud, wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. The sentencing came 6 weeks after the verdict. My cousins were there. My uncle Tobias had flown in from Abuja and sat in the gallery with the specific stillness of a man who had trusted his sister and was now sitting in a courtroom watching the evidence of what that trust had cost. My Aunt Celestine was not there. She had stopped speaking to me shortly after the investigation became known to the family, not because she believed my mother was innocent, but because she found the act of reporting unbearable, and I had decided I did not have the capacity to manage her discomfort on top of everything else. The judge was a woman named Honorable Adwoa Mensah, who had been on the criminal bench for 19 years, and who read her sentencing rationale with the measured attention of someone who understood that a room full of people was listening. She said that the crime was particularly serious because it had been committed against a deceased woman who could not speak for herself, against an estate built by decades of disciplined work, against beneficiaries who had trusted the executor with the inheritance left to them by someone who loved them. She sentenced my mother to 8 years in a state correctional facility with eligibility for parole after 5. My mother sat very still during the reading. She did not look at me. I did not look at her. We had been performing that particular not looking for a long time by then. I want to tell you about the month after the sentencing because I think it is the most honest part of this whole account. I went back to my apartment, and I put my keys on the hook, and I sat on my couch in the specific silence of a thing that is over, and felt something I had not expected, which was not relief, and not satisfaction, and not grief exactly, but a particular exhaustion, the exhaustion of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and has just been allowed to put it down. I called Taiwo that night. He said, "How are you?" I said I was not sure yet. He said, "Same." We stayed on the phone for 2 hours without talking about the case, just talking, the way we had talked when we were young, before any of this. He told me about a woman he was seeing. I told him about a hiking trail I had been meaning to try. We were 2 people who had survived something together and were learning what came after surviving it. The estate was reconstituted as fully as possible through the prosecution's restitution order. My mother was required to repay the full $387,000, which included clawback of what Douglas Akampong had been given, a process handled by a court-appointed receiver named Stella Park, with 22 years in financial recovery work and the cheerful efficiency of someone who enjoyed the puzzle of finding money that had been hidden. Not all of it was recoverable. The LLC had been partially dissolved and some assets had been spent. Taiwo, Ife, and I each received a portion of what was recovered. Not the full amount my grandmother had intended, but something. I put my share in an account I do not touch. I think of it as belonging to a woman who worked for 50 years and wanted her grandchildren to have a beginning, and I think about what I would want to do with a beginning that came from her. I see a therapist named Dr. Solomon Adeoye, licensed clinical psychologist, 14 years of practice, who specializes in family estrangement and complex grief. I started seeing him 6 months before the trial and continue to. He has helped me understand that loving someone and holding them accountable are not opposites, and that the most corrosive lie you can tell yourself in a situation like this is that loyalty requires silence. He asked me once what I would tell my grandmother if I could. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I said I would tell her that I did not let the discipline of a whole life be unmade without a fight. I would tell her that the money mattered less than the principle, and that the principle was worth the cost of defending it, even at the cost it turned out to be. He wrote something down. He said, "That sounds like something she would have believed." I said, "That's where I learned it." My mother has been in the facility for 14 months. She has not contacted me. I have not contacted her.